Let me start by saying and just noting that the end of the Cold War as a whole in 1989 and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought remarkably little change to the geopolitical structure of East Asia. You know, it's a little bit odd. I mean, right? You think about that. Well, okay, this very dramatic event happened in Europe, fundamentally altered the geostrategic situation. Supposedly, the structure of international relations in East Asia was a product of the Cold War as well, but why didn't it fundamentally change as well? All right? The US-Japan alliance remained, didn't change. US-ROK alliance remained. China, the Korean Peninsula, of course, remained divided. North Korea was much more isolated and certainly much poorer following the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But it didn't change its track. It didn't collapse. It didn't adopt a reform agenda. China continued on the path that it had been pursuing for a couple of decades. The only real change, and it was significant but limited, was that Russia established relations with South Korea, and in its wake, China established relations with Seoul. Now, that's a very important change, but the effect of that, I would say, is only being felt rather gradually, being felt maybe more right now than it was right at the beginning. This is really a sharp contrast to Europe, and I would suggest looking at it from this point in time, it looks that the Cold War system in Europe was quite artificial, right? It was an artificial division of the continent that corresponded to absolutely nothing in the historical development of Europe. It was not organic in the least. You know, the countries of the Eastern Bloc in Europe had never been grouped together in that way before. It made no sense to divide Europe in that way. It was not in relation to anything except the advance of the Soviet army. It was very artificial. The communist governments also in these bloc countries were imposed from outside, did not have deep roots in the countries or in the history of those countries, and so they were quite brittle, they were quite fragile, and they collapsed quite quickly. First of all, I think it enables us to recognize the historical roots of the North Korean system. All right. That it was not simply an implant from the Soviet Union as the East European communist systems were. All right. But it had roots in this very basic struggle going on in all countries of East Asia since the mid-19th century. Struggle for how to develop economically in a way that would guarantee national sovereignty against threats from abroad. Now, also, if we look at it that way, I think the problem with North Korea seems a bit more amenable to a solution, all right? Because in effect, that struggle has been pretty well resolved, you know, everywhere else in East Asia. So if we think of it, if we focus on that aspect of the struggle, I would suggest it's a little bit easier to come up with solutions for North Korea. Now, I would say also the Cold War delayed resolution of the issues left from the period of Japanese imperialism. Because once the Cold War began, the U.S., you know, subsumed Japan in its, you know, its security system in East Asia, and those issues were kind of frozen. So it's perfectly natural, I think, that today, in the wake of the collapse of the Cold War, the issues arising from Japan's imperialist past are coming to the surface. And it's increasingly important that they be resolved as thoroughly as they have been resolved with regard to Germany. With regard to the US-ROK alliance, it's natural also, I think, for that alliance to change quite considerably for two reasons. One, to the extent that the alliance was a product of the American conflict with the Soviet Union, then it's natural that the alliance adjust to a situation without that basic rationale. And then secondly, because under the radar, so to speak, of the Cold War, South Korea very energetically and very successfully resolved for itself the basic task of economic development, political, economic, social modernization. Sort of, under the radar screen in a way, if looked at from the Korean War, from the Cold War perspective. And so not only is the basic strategic rationale no longer there, but also the basic situation of the South Korean state is fundamentally different than it was when the alliance was created. Korea is now a fully mature country with a very successful economy, very highly developed political system, social system, fully able to compete in the world arena. As a way of seeing how fundamentally altered the situation is now, look at this trajectory that has happened in the development of the ROK itself. So I will close on that hopeful note of looking at what has been accomplished and how fundamentally different the tasks are now really in East Asia than they have been for the last century and a half. So I hope perhaps that will stimulate some thinking.